100 years ago, our predecessors were facing the turn of the century with maybe the same enthusiasm and apprehension as us. Today on Austin Faith Dialogue, we look at their religious world and contrast it with ours at the turn of this century. Austin Faith Dialogue today. Stay with us.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
We're glad you've joined us today for Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Sandy Wilder, your host, and today we're going to be talking about the world of religion as the century changes, as the century turns. What was happening about 100 years ago and what's happening now. And our guest is Dr. Stephen Reed, who's professor of Old Testament at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. It's good to have you, Steve.
It's good to be here, Sandy.
Let's have you first set the stage for you as a professor at a seminary. Talk to us a little bit about what you understand was happening about 100 years ago. Where were our predecessors in terms of the world of religion here in the United States?
Well, one of the first things that comes to mind is an awareness that you and I would not be sitting here having this conversation 100 years ago. The demographics of the church and the access in terms of participation has changed radically. In the late 19th century, we were still sort of reeling from the Civil War. At that time, the Methodist Church was divided, the Presbyterian Church was divided, the Baptist Church was divided. We had a string of anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish activity at work. The church was unsure of what this new age would bring. It was a time when most Americans were still related to the farm. Agriculture was still how people understood their life, and it was the church in that little town that nurtured them. It was a more traditional society. It was a society where people would live in the same town for generation after generation. It was also a time when there was an expectation that Jesus would come again soon. It was a time when American scholars would go to Europe to get their education and then bring it back here. Many of those things have changed in the last century.
So you're describing a time when the world was more circumscribed for people, both in a geographical sense, in a sense of who they interacted with, perhaps even in their sense of the role of religion in society. So what's happened over the last 100 years? Let's take the first example you used, that 100 years ago you and I wouldn't have been sitting down. So what's happened over the last 100 years here in the United States as people of faith have been active in society?
One of the things that we'd have to remember is the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a time when a lot of church people were very active in changing American culture. The Austin Seminary, one of its founders, Dr. Dabney, was instrumental in the separation of the Presbyterian Church and supported really segregation. And now that same seminary has a Hispanic professor, an African American professor. Things have changed pretty significantly in that regard.
So we're not there yet, but we have made some strides structurally and in terms of churches' openness and all that, right? And you point then to the fact that people of faith really spearheaded the civil rights movement?
People of faith did spearhead the civil rights movement. There's an interesting book by Bernice Reagan Johnson, who many people know from her work with Sweet Honey in the Rock. Her dissertation was on the civil rights movement music. And what she traces in that dissertation is that much of that music is derived from black sacred music. And she makes the case that the civil rights movement wouldn't have moved if there wouldn't have been music. And it wouldn't have had music if there wouldn't have been church. This was also a time when we had great interfaith activity. The Jewish community was very active during the civil rights movement. You had also a number of American Catholic organizations active. This was one of the times when Protestants, Catholics, and Jews came together on behalf of freedom. And that really changed the face of how we think about our life together.
So the churches, people have actually have really changed the landscape of the United States by working together on this particular issue. Which leads me to then have you say a little something about the place of women. My stereotype is that as the last century turned, women's roles were also much more circumscribed. And my sense now is that, again, a generalization, that women's roles have been opened up enormously within the church. Say a little bit about how this happened.
Women's roles in the church have opened up because women's roles in the society have opened up. In that regard, it's slightly different than the civil rights movement, where the church was sort of spearheading. Here, the church has been sort of dragged into the 20th century. And so we have, for instance, in the National Council of Churches, the immediate past executive director is a woman. We have in the Presbyterian seminary system a woman president. We're having a lot of firsts now. In fact, even in the decade that I've been at Austin Presbyterian Seminary, we've gone from having 3 women to having 7 women on the faculty. A third of the faculty is women. So the participation of women in the life of the church has jumped dramatically. Now, this isn't true in every denomination. For instance, if you were to go to a typical Protestant seminary, you would find that half of the students are women. But in other seminaries, more conservative seminaries, you would find the number of women significantly less.
Let me see if I can make an analogy here. My understanding of the civil rights movement is that with the impetus of people of faith and others, we eventually change structures and laws within society. I wonder if there's a similar analogy with the role of women in the church. Has women's greater participation led, do you believe, to any similar kinds of changes within the structures of society? Or has the reverse happened?
Women's participation has changed the very language we use when we talk about faith. There are a number of ways of describing God's action in Scripture, but a number of them, like the mother hen, didn't get much conversation in the 19th century. But in the second half of the 20th century, we started to pay attention to those feminine depictions of God. Certain characters who had all but out of the biblical canon, like Deborah, start to come back. And so the participation of women changes the very language of our own theological reflection. One of the biggest arguments, well, let's be candid, fights in American Protestantism has to do with language, inclusive language. A recent translation of the Bible wanted to move to an inclusive version, and it was threatened by its sponsors that if they made it inclusive, they wouldn't sponsor it anymore. So women's participation in the church has sparked one of the most interesting conflicts in the church in the late 20th century.
And obviously we're not done with this yet. We'll speculate about the next century here in a minute. And you're talking about the Bible leads me to question you then about the role of writings, scriptures within the church. My impression, again, from the last century is that the Holy Bible was really a very important book, perhaps the only book that the family had or could read. Say a little something about the place of the Bible within this last century. Where are we now as we get into the year 2000?
The Bible in the last century has become a book that's in every home, to now a book that we have advertising campaigns to sell. It's interesting, about a month or so ago in the Austin American-Statesman, there was an article, "Is the Bible good enough to read?" There's a multi-million-dollar campaign to encourage people to buy and read the Bible. Now, in the 19th century, that would have seemed ridiculous, that you had to push the sale of the Bible. But not only is there this push for the sale of the Bible, there's a sense that Americans no longer read their Bible. They carry it. Well, they have a place in their home where they think they could find it if they had to. But the reading of the Bible has really sort of fallen out. One of the most interesting characters in the 20th century is Archie Bunker. And Archie Bunker always quotes Scripture, typically incorrectly, but he always describes himself as a man who knows his Bible. Archie is not that unusual in American life. We have a reverence for the Bible, we just don't read it very often.
And that would have been unthinkable to our ancestors. What do you suppose happened over these last 100 years so that we know about the Bible, but we don't know it?
One of the things that happened in the last 20 years is radio and television. We don't do as much reading of books that aren't about us. When we can listen to a radio show or a television show that is about people who look like us, who talk like us, and have our values, people are less willing to say, "Why don't I sit down and read the book of Genesis or the Gospel of John?" Because they often don't see what they want to see there. It's not as entertaining. One of the things we're experiencing at the seminary is we're trying to rethink how we teach people theology, because we now have a generation of students who have watched more Sesame Street and more MTV than they've read Scripture. And so you have to think in new ways of how do you introduce a book to people who are used to Bert and Ernie.
Or maybe people who are literate in different kinds of ways, right? And
Yes.
we can come back to that in the second half of the show. Half an hour is just too short to cover all this. Stay with us for the second half of Austin Faith Dialogue. We'll be right back. Okay. Glad you're still with us for Austin Faith Dialogue. Today we're talking about, as the century turns, what's happening now in the field of religion and what was going on 100 years ago. And our guest is Dr. Stephen Reed, professor of Old Testament at Austin Presbyterian Seminary. Again, Steve, it's good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
And we left off in the first half where we were just beginning to touch on new technology and the fact that as people are literate now in different ways from simply print, our of our approach to our reverence for the Bible is very different. So maybe you want to say something else about the role of technology in faith over these last 100 years.
Well, let's take the way technology has shaped not only our way of knowing and understanding text, but our way of worship. At the early part of this century, to live 20 miles away from your place of worship would have been almost a day's drive. Now we think of it as an easy commute. Much of what we have in terms of the mega churches wouldn't be possible without the technology of automobiles. Many of those churches are also, interestingly enough, working on television ministry, something that wouldn't have been available 100 years ago. So television, cars, and what would a congregation be without a telephone tree and a chance to call people? These are all things that have happened and really shape how we worship together and how we function as a believing community, and are fairly recent. One of the things that's really changing seminary life is the internet.
How so?
Because now, if you have a Bible quotation and you're not exactly sure where you can find it, you can pull up the internet and ask where it is, and it'll tell you. The whole Bible is now online. And so you can do word studies, phrase studies, and you can even get a sermon through the internet. So these technological things are changing the way that we think of ourselves as religious communities.
The way we even prepare our professionals to minister in communities. Well, now, we have talked an awful lot about what's happened within basically Protestantism. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what's happened in the last century in some broad sweeps. What's happened, say, with our Roman Catholic friends? There have been some major changes in the last century in Roman Catholicism.
One couldn't write the history of this century without paying attention to Vatican II. This was something that revolutionized not only Roman Catholicism, but revolutionized Christianity. Because now there were enough points of common interest that Roman Catholics and Protestants began to read the same books, to converse. Prior to Vatican II, the number of Roman Catholic biblical scholars that participated in the wide biblical community was fairly small. Now we take for granted Roman Catholic participation in all major Bible projects. For instance, in the New Revised Standard Version, there are a number of Roman Catholic scholars on the team, and the National Council of Churches, which is a Protestant organization, wouldn't think of a translation committee that didn't include Roman Catholics and Jews. And that has been a major change from the previous century.
In the previous century, then, our predecessors would have had Roman Catholic neighbors, perhaps, but there wouldn't have been any interaction, is what you're saying,
There wouldn't
right?
have been any interaction. And even this year, we had that historic connection between the Lutheran Church and the Roman Catholic Church. These are the sorts of things that Vatican II really opened up and made possible, and we've been really reaping the benefits for now almost half a century.
And you briefly mentioned our Jewish friends, and certainly there have been major impacts on Judaism in this century. Tell us a little bit about where Judaism was at the turn of the last century, and where are we now? What's happened?
At the turn of the last century, there was still a significant optimism throughout Europe and throughout the United States that something great is going to happen. And then instead of something great, we got the Holocaust. The Holocaust still defines what human evil is. And you still have American Christians who hold in the back of their mind an awareness of the Holocaust and makes them more tolerant today, because they see the connection between tolerance and avoiding another similar sort of religious repression. In fact, as we look at religious oppression and persecution, we often compare that to the Holocaust, and it becomes one of the defining moments of the century.
Holocaust then becomes shorthand for great evil, not just in the religious field, but in other parts of society.
In other parts of society. It also means that the sort of naive optimism of the early 20th century, what we thought was going to be the Christian century, is transformed, and we are always now much more aware of our ability to slip into evil in order to make our own group seem like the elect group.
As you talk, I'm thinking that perhaps that's a loss of innocence, moving toward greater maturity, greater sensitivity, greater understanding. Much as a human being grows, perhaps we in our faith have grown too.
We have grown. We're not as naive as we used to be. The challenge as we move from the 20th century to the 21st is to come up with energy and excitement. One of the things that we're seeing is a number of our institutions are starting to get tired. We see a number of denominations, Protestant denominations, where people are saying, why should we cooperate with one another? I like my congregation. Why do I need to worry about those other congregations? We've seen that sort of fracturing in the Presbyterian Church. We've seen it in other denominations. The question is, can we formulate an energy about God's mission that leads us into the new century, as opposed to being nostalgic for the good old days of post-World War II faith?
So that as you then, as a professor at a seminary, speculate about our coming century, or at least a few coming decades, you'd see a task first as gathering energy so that we can find new and creative ways to work together. What else would you see that we, people of faith, need to do? What are some of the other challenges that you see out there for us?
One of the other challenges is, how will we train persons to minister in small, poor communities? If you want to minister to an upper middle class, affluent congregation, probably of your own race, there are plenty of places for you to get training to do that. But if you want to pastor, or you want to lead a small congregation in a rural community where the compensation is not, there aren't very many avenues for you to pursue. One of the interesting things that a number of seminaries are now beginning to explore is what we call distance learning, so that people don't have to relocate. Now, the people who will really benefit from this the most are people in small towns who say, I don't want to sell my house and have to move to Austin, mortgage my soul, and then not be able to afford to pastor people like myself. See, if we can come up with a system so that people in Brownwood, people in West, and other parts of Texas can get a good theological education without the expense of leaving home, then we can revitalize faith communities. And this is of interest in many of the faiths. The Roman Catholic Church is working on distance learning, as Protestants, and so I think that's one of the avenues that we'll be moving in the future.
Some creative ways to minister to people right where they are. And what I hear you saying is that not everyone's going to live in a city, which is good also. What else do you see happening that we people of faith are going to need to deal with? For instance, there is much conversation about changing demographics, not just in Texas, but in the entire United States, changing income balances, changing numbers of people who are Protestant versus Roman Catholic versus Jewish versus some other faith. In all this mix, what else do we need to be prepared for?
What we need to be prepared for is a community where the shape of the participants starts to look pretty different, and where we are able to be articulate about what we believe. Most of us are used to believing what we believe and aren't very eloquent about describing it. In a new world where you have much more mixture of Christian, Jewish, Islam, Buddhist, Hindu, then each group needs to be eloquent about who are we. Not in a chauvinistic way, but in a way that enables everyone to be nurtured in their tradition and not oppressive of other person's traditions. Also, the challenge is the church is still fairly segregated. And the challenge for us is to reach out so that the church starts to look like America, and that the synagogue starts to look like America, and the mosque as well.
What will that do? One last question here. What will that do for your work? You are in a classroom, you are in a pretty stable institution, a place where people come to be prepared for ministry. But what will these changes in societies do for how you do your work?
It will complicate my work immensely, because no longer will I be able to depend on the same old books that we have for the last 25 years. Now we'll start to pay attention to books written by Spanish-speaking authors. We'll pay attention to books written by Asian American authors. And we'll have to make reference not only to Huckleberry Finn, but to Toni Morrison's Beloved. And at that point, you're really changing the nature of the common cultural, religious conversation.
Well, in all this, Steve, I certainly hope, and I'm sure your colleagues do too, that 100 years from now, people will look back at us and say, they did a good job preparing for this 21st century so that all these dreams that we have really do come true. And Steve, thank you for being here and helping us take, in just a short 30 minutes, take a look at where we've been over the last 100 years in religion. I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you, Sandy.
And we appreciate you joining us this week on Austin Faith Dialogue. Tune in again next week and into the next century as we continue to bring you more good programs here on Austin Faith Dialogue.